I always felt that my family's story was anything but ordinary. I'm 23 with a younger sister. Let's call her Colette, who just turned 18. For a long time, I believed she embodied everything malicious in this world, though I tried to convince my parents otherwise. They never listened, and it took a recent disaster for them to finally see what I saw all along. It all began with my parents' unwavering devotion to Colette. My mother had suffered a devastating miscarriage before Colette was born, and when my sister arrived a few years later, they viewed her as a miracle. From that day on, they flooded her with affection and attention, placing her at the very heart of our family. I cared for her once, back when we were both little, but as time passed, I realized Colette possessed a remarkable talent for manipulation. She could twist any situation in her favor, always painting herself as the victim while everyone else bought into her charade. One birthday, I received a beautiful heirloom pocket watch from my grandmother, who wanted to pass down a piece of our family's history. Colette's envy was immediate. She asked repeatedly if she could borrow the watch, but I refused. After all, it was a special gift meant for me. She even tried to appeal to our parents, but there was only so much they could do since the watch came directly from our grandparents. That same night, she placed a spider in my pillowcase, fully aware of my phobia. I woke to the horrifying sensation of 8 tiny legs crawling across my face and screamed loud enough to rattle the windows. My parents rushed into my room, and Colette feigned concern, but later she admitted that she had done it to teach me a lesson for not sharing my pocket watch. She wore a smug expression, showing no hint of remorse. This incident was only one of many. Colette managed to get away with everything because my parents refused to see the truth. They had always told themselves she was their treasured miracle, too pure and sweet for any wrongdoing. In their eyes, I was the moody older sister stirring up trouble. And so, for years, I felt isolated in my own home, silently watching Colette orchestrate her manipulative schemes without consequence. I recall the time I finally gathered the courage to invite a classmate I liked over to watch a film. My heart pounded with excitement as I selected the perfect outfit, imagining a warm, light-hearted evening. Instead, the moment my friend stepped through the door, Colette tossed a glass of juice at me, leaving me splattered and humiliated. I had no choice but to dash upstairs to change while fighting back tears of embarrassment. Later, as we settled in for the movie, she settled in too, rattling off every mortifying childhood story she could think of, taking obvious pleasure in my discomfort. By the time my guest left, Colette made it clear she believed he could do better than me, and I realized she had ruined any chance I had with him in the space of a single afternoon. I tried to tell my parents about this incident, and so many others, but they always brushed aside my concerns as evidence of a simple sibling squabble. They believed Colette was young, inexperienced, and harmless at heart. Whenever I persisted, they labeled me the troublemaker. So I learned to stop voicing my frustration. They continued to shower her with affection, while I hovered on the edge of our family, as though I were the one who had done something wrong. Determined to step out of that toxic environment, I focused intensely on my studies and secured admission to a university away from home. Moving out felt like a lifeline. Still, every time I came back for a visit, Colette's hostility manifested in subtle but unmistakable ways. She rarely spoke to me, made a point of sitting as far away as possible during meals, and rolled her eyes if I dared to initiate conversation with our parents. It was obvious she resented my very presence. Her maliciousness didn't end there. She would borrow clothes, gadgets, or anything else she fancied from my room, and then return them broken or mysteriously lost. When I raised the issue, my parents told me it was just a misunderstanding. They urged me to compromise for the sake of family harmony. Eventually, I grew tired of fighting an uphill battle and began spending holidays with friends or classmates. My parents seemed indifferent, viewing my absence as little more than me enjoying my newfound independence. But I knew I was simply trying to find peace where I could. After finishing high school, Colette discovered her grades weren't good enough for a traditional university, so she enrolled in a local junior college. This arrangement allowed her to stay under my parents' roof, with no pressing reason to leave. Meanwhile, I embarked on a new chapter of my life, working at a multinational firm in Redwood Falls, thoroughly enjoying the independence it offered. My contact with my parents was minimal but cordial, and I kept Colette out of my life altogether. Not too long ago, my father experienced a terrifying heart attack that nearly took his life. By some stroke of luck, he survived and was hospitalized in time. As soon as my mother informed me, I booked the first flight I could and hurried home. His doctors prescribed an array of medications and instructed him to adopt a healthier routine. Since being discharged, my father seemed eager to mend old rifts and spend more time with the family, often expressing how fortunate he felt to be alive. Understanding the urgency behind his words, I decided to remain at the house for a short while, taking advantage of my job's remote work policy. I noticed right away that Colette resented my presence, though I did my best to steer clear of conflict, especially given my father's fragile health. One morning, as I was attempting to focus on being supportive, my father suggested a family trip, something we hadn't done together in years. Despite my misgivings, I agreed, sensing how important it was to him. Colette looked far from pleased, but she complied without objection. My father proceeded to arrange everything, from airline bookings to hotel reservations. I cleared my calendar at work, instructing my colleagues not to disturb me so I could devote myself fully to this rare chance for family bonding. However, the moment we reached the airport, I learned that my ticket had been inexplicably canceled. My father was insistent he had completed the purchase for all of us, yet when the details were checked, only the seat in my name had been annulled. The confusion on his face was unmistakable, and I could almost feel Colette's smug satisfaction radiating from somewhere behind. I stood in the bustling terminal, trying to make sense of why my ticket, apparently purchased along with everyone else's, had been canceled. Glancing over at Colette, I saw the triumphant expression I had come to dread. She seemed all too satisfied, and I realized in that moment she must have been the one behind my canceled seat, most likely by tampering with the reservations on my father's computer. My frustration boiled over, but I felt utterly powerless as she continued to give me that smug stare, while my parents clung to their belief that the error had to be a fluke or the airline's fault. Their unwavering faith in her innocence left me speechless. Since no other flights were available that day, my hopes for a family vacation were dashed. I could have tried flying out alone the next morning, but the thought of traveling separately and then sharing a cramped hotel room with Colette filled me with dread. I had held out some faint hope she might have outgrown her cruel games, but the ticket fiasco proved otherwise, and I feared what else she might orchestrate if I insisted on joining them. My father briefly considered postponing the trip, but he quickly pivoted to how much he'd been anticipating a getaway after his recent health scare. My mother added that I traveled a great deal for work anyway and wouldn't be missing much. It was as though they wanted me to encourage them to continue without me, and when I did, they eagerly took the offer. I stood there, stunned, as they went through security without me, fully aware that I wouldn't be tagging along. Even though I loathed the thought of wasting money on accommodations and plane tickets, I felt an even deeper sadness that my parents seemed so unfazed by my absence. In that single moment, it became painfully clear that they had no qualms about taking a vacation as a family of three. I watched my parents and Colette head off through the bustling terminal, practically glowing with anticipation as they set out for their vacation without me. Standing there alone, I felt an odd mix of betrayal and relief. Rather than return to my parents' place and spend another minute in the echo of their departure, I went straight back to my apartment in Redwood Falls. I tried to look on the bright side, using the time off work I'd already arranged to reconnect with old friends, explore my neighborhood, and devour books I'd been meaning to read. It became a makeshift staycation, and I was determined to enjoy it despite the circumstances. Occasionally, my parents would call from their trip, showing me the sights and chatting about how wonderful everything was. Their glowing smiles and relaxed demeanors only underscored how little my absence seemed to affect them. Although I wasn't devastated about missing a trip I had never been fully invested in, the calls reminded me once again of the long-standing favoritism in our family. I tried to brush it aside, telling myself they'd finally see Colette's true nature one day. Little did I know that day was coming sooner than expected. Midway through their vacation, I woke to a string of missed calls from my mother. My thoughts immediately jumped to my father's health, fearing his recovery had taken a sudden turn for the worse. When I called back, my mother's voice was strained and fearful. She explained that his vital heart medications had been disappearing one by one. Already stressed by being in a foreign place, they searched their hotel room top to bottom, worried that if his prescriptions couldn't be replaced, his fragile condition might worsen. Eventually, my mother ventured into Colette's adjoining room to borrow a simple item, only to uncover all of the missing pills hidden in a drawer by the bed. The shock hit her like a physical blow. When my father saw the evidence, he finally grasped how deliberately Colette had jeopardized his health. In that moment, they recognized just how far their so-called miracle child was willing to go, and it shattered the image of perfection they'd so carefully maintained on her behalf. My mother's voice trembled as she asked whether they should confront Colette immediately. I advised her to wait until they returned home so they could gather their emotions and proof before facing my sister. I knew that cornering Colette on foreign soil would only trigger her masterful manipulation tactics, and she would likely concoct 1,000 excuses to dodge any blame. Yet, later that same night, I received a call from my father, who sounded as if the ground had fallen out from under him. Colette had been arrested. Apparently, when confronted about the vanishing medications, she unleashed her anger, hurling objects and berating my father. She spewed threats about punishing them if they continued to involve me in their family life. Things escalated so severely that hotel staff felt compelled to call the police. Once the authorities arrived, Colette's fury only burned brighter. She refused to cooperate, taunted the officers, and ended up spending the next 24 hours in custody. In desperation to escape this unraveling nightmare, my parents tried rebooking their flight once Colette was released, but they quickly discovered their wallets and passports had gone missing. With a sinking feeling, they realized Colette had likely tossed them or stashed them away, leaving them stranded. For the first time, my mother, who had always idolized her miracle child, was forced to acknowledge my sister's malicious side. She was practically in tears when she phoned me, admitting that without travel documents and money, they had no way home. I offered to transfer them funds immediately, but I insisted they locate their passports first. Deep down, I felt certain Colette hadn't destroyed those documents. She was far too cunning for that. Hearing my mother's voice break as she apologized, I was hit by a wave of conflicting emotions. I could sense their newfound gratitude for my help, but I couldn't ignore the pain of a lifetime spent overshadowed by Colette's status as the favored child. Even with this apology, the scars of their past favoritism ran deep, and part of me couldn't help wondering if I would ever truly forgive them for loving her so completely while leaving me on the sidelines. I sometimes question whether I'm being too harsh by withholding forgiveness from my parents, who left me out of a trip they seemed perfectly fine enjoying without me, until everything fell apart, and they returned pleading for my understanding. However, years of feeling cast aside because of their unwavering focus on Colette make it difficult to simply let go of my resentment. In the aftermath of Colette's arrest abroad, my parents called me daily with updates, their voices laced with fatigue and desperation. After Colette's brief stint in jail, they confronted her about the missing passports, warning that if she refused to reveal their location, they would involve the authorities once more. Cornered, she finally admitted where she had hidden the documents. When my parents returned home, they immediately demanded that Colette gather her belongings and leave. It was clear they had reached a point of no return, fearing that she might endanger my father's health again by tampering with his medication. A fierce argument erupted, and she unleashed every accusation imaginable, blaming my parents for inviting me on the trip she believed should have been hers alone. She insisted they disown me, convinced she alone deserved their undivided attention. In a disturbing display of jealousy, Colette threatened to spread rumors of neglect she claimed to have endured as a child. She insisted she would report my parents to the authorities on unfounded charges if they pushed her to move out. Because my parents are well-respected medical professionals, the mere threat of false allegations alarmed them deeply. Her behavior only escalated. She resorted to breaking household items whenever she discovered my parents speaking to me on the phone. She hid their car keys to prevent them from going to work and caused uproar during dinner if my mother refused her demands. My mother called me in tears one evening, describing how Colette had shattered furniture and then blared music through the house, depriving everyone of any hope for rest. With each frantic update, I grew more anxious. While I had long suspected Colette's capacity for manipulation, I never truly imagined she would become this volatile. Seeing my parents finally acknowledge the damage she was capable of should have brought some sense of relief. but it mostly reminded me of how many years I spent warning them, only to be dismissed as jealous or overreacting. Even now, as they reach out to me for comfort and assistance, I grapple with whether I can or should forgive them for the hurt they caused by favoring Colette so completely for so long. I could see how much the situation was wearing my parents down. Each call brought more distressing news. Colette's anger was spiraling further out of control, and they were terrified of what she might do next. Much as I wanted them to recognize her true nature, I never imagined it would escalate to the point where my own parents were in genuine danger. I avoided returning home, fearing my presence might fuel Colette's volatility and spark another explosive confrontation. Instead, I urged my parents to seek legal counsel, believing it was the safest path to protect them and restore order to their lives. Before long, my worst fears were realized. Colette attacked them with a knife during a furious argument. In panic, my parents contacted the police, who arrived and arrested her on assault charges. Once Colette was in custody, my parents finally reached the painful conclusion that they needed a long-term fix. At the lawyer's recommendation, they filed for her eviction, an agonizing choice, since it meant taking legal action against their own daughter. They bailed Colette out of jail only to serve her with a formal notice demanding that she vacate their home. The letter spelled out the reasons and gave her a deadline to leave, ensuring everything was done by the book. Next came court proceedings, which left my parents feeling both sad and guilty. Still, they saw no other way. Ultimately, the court granted an order compelling Colette to move out. If she refused, law enforcement would remove her. She's set to be gone within a week, and my parents can finally exhale, having taken a crucial step toward reclaiming their home and their peace of mind. Throughout this ordeal, I've stayed in close contact, reassuring them from afar. As soon as Colette moves out, I'm bringing my parents to Redwood Falls for a few weeks so they can rest. After all they've been through, they deserve a break. Time away from the stress and a chance to rebuild their spirits. It'll also allow us to spend real quality time together, a small way for me to show support after all that's happened. In the midst of these developments, my parents offered me a heartfelt apology. They acknowledged every wrong turn, every instance of dismissing my concerns over Colette's behavior. Many people suggested Colette might need a psychiatric evaluation, but given she's an adult, we can't force her to comply. Her unpredictable outbursts make it risky to press too hard. For now, my parents are focused on following through with the eviction so they can start healing. Once they're ready to confront the possibility of a deeper mental health issue, I hope Colette will be willing to get the help she clearly needs, even if it's on her own terms. My parents arrived in Redwood Falls to spend a few days with me, hoping to find some relief from the chaos that had consumed our family for the past several months. One evening, while we sat around my small dining table, they finally opened up about all that had transpired. Their regret was palpable, and it felt surreal to hear them candidly admit they had been oblivious to Colette's true nature for years. My father spoke first, his voice tinged with remorse, acknowledging he had brushed aside my concerns every time I tried to warn him. He never imagined Colette could turn out the way she had, and he realized now that he and my mother had overlooked her manipulative tendencies. My mother, equally shaken, explained that she had convinced herself Colette was the miracle child she never expected to have, which blinded her to everything else, including the pain I had quietly endured. She confessed that their unwavering favoritism had impacted me more than she ever dared to consider. Although I had longed for this moment, a genuine admission of their mistakes, I felt an odd mixture of relief and heartache. I recounted the moments of torment I experienced over the years, the countless nights I lay awake wondering why my parents continually dismissed my struggles. They listened, visibly shaken as they grasped the extent of my isolation and the damage caused by Colette's behavior. They apologized over and over, explaining how their desire to protect Colette had eclipsed their obligation to protect me. It was a bittersweet moment. I finally got the acknowledgement I had craved, but it came after so much hurt and distance between us. Still, it was the first time in years that we openly recognized the deep-seated issues that had plagued our family. In that moment, I realized forgiveness wouldn't be immediate. The wounds left by years of neglect wouldn't magically disappear just because my parents now understood the harm they had caused. But I also recognized the importance of this new honesty. We agreed to move forward slowly, trusting each other in small steps, and for now, I plan to appreciate the days I had with them in Redwood Falls. Perhaps this trip would mark the start of a long overdue healing process for all of us. Over the following days, my parents and I made the most of our time together, strolling through the lively neighborhoods of Redwood Falls, savoring long, relaxed meals, and simply enjoying each other's company for the first time in ages. It felt surprisingly uplifting to mend the emotional wounds that had formed through years of unspoken tension and skewed priorities. I realized that part of why they came to visit wasn't just to put physical distance between themselves and Colette, but to rekindle the family we had almost lost. They wanted a fresh start, and I found I wanted the same. Naturally, our conversations turned to Colette's future. She was currently staying with a friend, but my parents still felt deeply responsible for her well-being, despite all the pain she had inflicted. Recognizing that her behavior might be fueled by underlying issues rather than mere spite, they hoped to broach the idea of a mental health evaluation. The challenge was figuring out how to suggest it without forcing her hand, as she was an adult. Pushing too hard might only trigger more aggression. They planned on meeting with Colette after returning home, ideally in a neutral, public location where she would be less inclined to cause a scene. I chose to stay in the background for now, aware that my presence might aggravate her long-standing resentment. Our collective hope was that Colette would see we still cared about her, and that we wanted her to get whatever help she needed, even if it meant facing the difficult truth about her actions. We weren't trying to cast blame. Rather, we wanted her to understand that family can be a source of support, provided everyone is willing to face reality and work toward genuine healing. In the weeks that followed, my parents finished their visit and returned home with cautious optimism. We parted on a heartfelt note, promising to stay open and honest about our emotions. They still planned to meet Colette somewhere public, hoping the distance from the family house and the gravity of recent events might nudge her toward a calmer conversation. When they finally did, tensions ran high at first. Colette arrived visibly guarded, defensive from the start. My parents offered her a chance to speak, to express everything that had fueled her anger and resentment for so long. She resisted, insulted them, and threatened to leave. But, surprisingly, something in her demeanor changed. Perhaps the realization that, after all the turmoil, they were still reaching out. Maybe it was the fear of truly being on her own. Slowly, she began to soften, if only a little. The conversation wasn't a miracle cure. Colette refused formal therapy, at least for the moment, insisting she could handle her own life. However, she agreed to keep talking with my parents on neutral ground, a small step forward. My mother, despite all that had happened, held out hope that Colette would eventually accept help on her own terms. My father, although exhausted and guarded, found it in himself to support that measured optimism. As for me, I chose to keep a respectful distance. I knew Colette still harbored hostility toward me, and my parents and I understood that pushing a grand family reunion too soon could shatter the fragile progress they had made. Instead, I remained available by phone and video calls, staying informed without forcing myself into the middle of every discussion. Gradually, day by day, life found a new rhythm. My parents, now more mindful than ever of each other's needs and feelings, planned short getaways, a weekend at a lakeside cabin, a simple day trip out of town. They focused on recovering from the emotional ordeal that had nearly torn them apart. Meanwhile, I returned to my work in Redwood Falls, grateful for a chance to breathe in a life far less chaotic. The family is still healing. The wounds of favoritism and betrayal don't vanish overnight. But for the first time in what feels like forever, we have a shared vision of the future, one that involves honesty, boundaries, and self-awareness. Whether Colette joins us in that future remains uncertain, but at least the door to reconciliation is cracked open. And for me, that small glimmer of hope is enough for now.